My name is Eleanor Whitaker, and at 81 years old, I never thought I'd be starting over. But this is the story of the day my own son told me I was nothing, and how I proved that I was everything they forgot. They say some breaks don't happen, all at once, that cracks form long before the structure finally collapses. I think, looking back, that's how it was with my family. The fracture wasn't the shouting. It wasn't even the silence that followed. It was everything in between. The invisible erosion of being needed, then no longer wanted. That Sunday morning began like most others. The sun poured through the kitchen windows in slanted beams, catching dust motes in its light. I was at the table, folding napkins the way I always had, crisply in thirds, then again in half. The smell of eggs lingered faintly in the air. Toast popped up unattended. A blue mug sat near the sink, its handle wet from a recent rinse. Daniel came in first, shoulders hunched, eyes on his phone. Emily followed, barefoot, scrolling through something or someone. I stopped trying to keep track. "Where's my travel?" "Mug?" Daniel asked, not looking up. I turned slightly. "I think I saw it on the hall shelf yesterday. Maybe behind the umbrella stand." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked briskly to the sink, opened the cupboard, and paused. Then, "Spun, it's not here. You probably moved it again," he said sharply. "I didn't touch it," I said, quiet but firm. His eyes narrowed, jaw tightening. "Well, it didn't vanish on its own, did it?" Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She didn't say anything, but her look said enough. One of those blank stares you give a child who keeps asking questions you're tired of answering. "I only offered a suggestion," I replied. "No need to." And that's when it happened. "You need to get out of this house. You're nothing here now." The words echoed louder than the clink of any mug, sharper than the edge of the counter he leaned on. For a moment, time stopped. Think he realized what he'd said the second it left his lips. But he didn't take it back. That would have been too human, too soft. And Daniel had learned to speak in finalities. Emily didn't flinch. She stood there, her arms still, folded, her mouth twitching at the corner like a smirk she was swallowing. She looked at me like I was something old and dusty left too long on the shelf. I sat there a moment longer, unsure if I was more stunned by what was said or by how unsurprised I truly felt. My hands, once steady, trembled slightly as I reached for my shawl draped over the back of the chair. I didn't cry, not in front of them, not even when I passed the photo of Tom, my late husband, still perched loyally on the bookshelf by the dining room. He had built this house, painted its walls, laid the tile in the foyer himself. His hands shaped the very floors they now walked over without thought, and now our son had decided I no longer belonged. I stepped out onto the back porch, the wood creaking under my slippers. The air was cold for spring. A sparrow fluttered near, the feeder, wings beating in rhythm. I remember thinking, even the birds come back every season. But I don't know where I'll go. I wrapped the shawl tighter around my shoulders and stood there, still, invisible, cracked open like the porcelain sugar bowl Daniel once dropped and swept away without apology. There was no apology now either. Later, that afternoon, no one mentioned the morning's outburst. The air was heavy with forced normalcy. Daniel didn't look at me. Emily spoke only to remind him about a grocery list. I cleared my own plate from lunch and retreated downstairs, to the guest room turned prison I'd been quietly relegated to since January. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands in my lap, and stared at the boxes I still hadn't unpacked. They told me I could move in after the pneumonia scare. "Just until you're back on your feet, Mom." But I had learned that in some houses, temporary becomes permanent, and then permanence turns into resentment. The clock ticked softly, in the corner. My suitcase was still beneath the bed, untouched. I remember whispering to myself, just once, "What did I do wrong?" But even as I asked it, I knew the truth. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd simply lived long enough to become inconvenient. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair, wrapped in a throw blanket, and watched shadows move across the walls. Something had shifted. Not just in them, in me. The fracture had happened. And though I hadn't yet realized it, that crack would soon lead to something else entirely. Not defeat, but awakening. After that morning, I didn't return to the kitchen table. Emily suggested I take some space, and Daniel helped carry my things to the basement, not with cruelty, but with the quiet efficiency of someone moving clutter from a room. They didn't ask if I wanted to go downstairs. They just said, "It's better this way." For who, they didn't say. The basement had no windows, just a narrow slit of light above the washer, where dust floated endlessly in silence. They set up a small cot in the corner, a folding table, and a lamp that flickered when the microwave upstairs turned on. I arranged my few remaining things neatly. A photograph of Tom, the one where he's laughing with wind in his hair. A porcelain teacup with a crack I never fixed. And a tiny green vase, the last birthday gift from my late sister before she passed. I placed them on the shelf above the cot like relics in a forgotten museum. Meals changed too. Dinner used to be a shared thing, even when it was quiet. But now my plate would show up on the top step, sometimes lukewarm, sometimes cold. I'd hear the thud of it landing, the footsteps walking away. No knock, no voice, just the sound of dishes being left behind. I never complained. I suppose I thought if I stayed quiet, things would improve. That maybe Emily was just tired or Daniel was stressed from work. But the distance didn't close. It only widened. The children used to run down here, squealing with joy. They'd beg me to read bedtime stories or sneak them cookies I hid in my drawer. Now they stayed upstairs, eyes fixed to screens, trained to see me as an interruption. When I tried to come up to say goodnight, Emily would smile tightly and say, "Let's not overstimulate them, Margaret. They need routine." Routine. That word felt like a lock on a door I was no longer allowed to open. I started writing again. Old habits from long ago, when I'd kept journals as a young wife, waiting on Tom to come home from the night shift. Only now, I didn't write about hope or homemaking. I wrote letters I never sent. To Tom, to my sister, even to myself. Sometimes I wrote, "Where did I go?" Other days, "Would anyone notice if I left?" Emily began making little comments. Over time, subtle but sharp. "You've lived your life," she'd say while folding laundry, her tone always light. Or, "Not everyone gets to grow old surrounded by family, you know. You should be grateful." Grateful. That word stung. More than anything, as if shelter was a favor. As if I hadn't raised the very man who now stood beside her, watching her dismantle me piece by piece. One day I noticed the green vase was gone. Just gone. When I asked about it, Emily shrugged. "Must have gotten knocked over. Things get dusty down there." Her voice was dismissive, casual. But the way she didn't meet my eyes, I knew. She had taken it. Just like she took my favorite chair from the sunroom, now sitting in the garage beneath boxes. I didn't fight her. It's a strange thing, the way you begin to vanish from your own life without even realizing it. You let go of one thing to keep the peace, then another, until one day you look around and wonder where you went. At church, I used to feel seen. The warm squeeze of Mrs. Dyer's hand, the gentle nod from the pastor. But I hadn't been in months. When Janet called to ask why I stopped coming, I lied and said my knees had gotten worse. She offered to pick me up, but I declined. I was ashamed. ashamed that I'd let myself disappear, ashamed that I had no answer for the most obvious question. Why are you still living with them if they don't want you? But the hardest moment came one Friday evening. I heard music and laughter upstairs, wine glasses clinking, a dinner party. I stood quietly on the stairs, just far enough to listen. I could smell garlic and rosemary. I could hear Emily's laugh, bright, performative, the one she used in front of guests. I waited. Maybe someone would call me up, ask if I'd like to join, just for dessert. Just for a hello. But no one did. Instead, I sat on the last step in silence until the house dimmed and the music faded into the hum of the dishwasher. A few days later, I overheard them planning a beach weekend. Daniel talked about the weather. Emily reminded him to pack the kids' goggles. No one mentioned me. I waited again. Maybe they'd ask if I wanted to come. Maybe I could just sit near the sand and watch. But on Saturday morning, the car engine roared to life, and I watched them leave through the narrow basement window, their luggage bouncing in the trunk. No goodbye, no note, just silence. After they left, I pulled my suitcase from beneath the bed. It was still packed from last summer, the trip we never took because Emily said it would stress the children to have too many people. I'd kept it ready. I suppose I'd hoped they'd change their minds. Sat beside it for hours. The house was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock upstairs through the floorboards, the echo of my own breath, the faint rustle of wind against the trees. And for the first time, I said aloud what I had written so many times in my journal. They've erased me. It wasn't a question. It was a truth. A truth that now sat in my chest like a stone. But what they didn't realize, what they never even thought to imagine, was that in erasing me from their world, they had cleared a path. One I would soon take. And when I did, it wouldn't be with bitterness. It would be with purpose. Birthdays used to mean something. Even the quiet ones. Even after Tom passed, I always lit a candle, always made a small cake, always sat with a warm drink and let the silence hold me kindly for a while. This year, I did the same. I baked a lemon sponge. Just one layer, nothing fancy. My knees ached as I stood at the counter mixing, but I didn't mind. The scent reminded me of the early years, when Daniel would beg to lick the bowl, cheeks dusted in flour, eyes bright with sugar and trust. That morning, I dressed a little nicer. I wore my pearl earrings, the ones Tom gave me on our 30th anniversary. I curled the ends of my hair and wore my blue shawl, the one that made me feel like myself, even when I no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. I waited all day. Not a text. Not a card. Not even a passing happy birthday over a plate of leftovers. The cake sat untouched on the small table near my cot. A single candle, unlit. I didn't want to waste the match. By evening, I told myself maybe they'd forgotten, in the rush. Maybe the children had schoolwork, or Emily had errands. I tried to forgive it, to brush it aside. But the truth was already sitting with me, cold and plain, long before the daylight faded. That night, I came upstairs to get a glass of water. The lights were off, but voices murmured through the crack of the bedroom door. Emily was on the phone. I told Daniel not to mention it. She'll forget anyway. I mean, what's the point? She's old. Every day's the same to her now. I froze. The words were a quiet dagger, not shouted, not cruel in tone, just dismissive. Like I wasn't a person, but a piece of furniture, something worn and gathering dust. I stood there, barefoot on the hardwood, my hand trembling against the banister. I didn't knock. I didn't cry. I simply turned around and went back down the stairs. The cake was still there, the candle still unlit. I sat on the edge of the cot, staring at it. My fingers rested on my lap, still and cold. And in that moment, something inside me, something soft and hopeful, withered. The next morning, I didn't rise. I lay on my back, watching the ceiling fan spin in slow, hypnotic circles. Around and around like my thoughts, like the promises Daniel once made. "We'll take care of you, Mom. You won't have to worry about a thing." But promises mean nothing when your presence becomes an inconvenience. I'd become a ghost in the home I helped pay for. A body that ate in silence. A shadow that lived downstairs. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was the slow erosion of dignity. The way I started believing maybe I had forgotten. Forgotten what birthdays felt like. Forgotten what it meant to be cared for without expectation. That evening, I dusted the photo of Tom. It sat on the narrow shelf beside my bed, him in his uniform, smiling like he always did when he came, home from work early and surprised me in the garden. My fingers lingered on the frame. "You wouldn't have let this happen," I whispered. And I meant it. Tom had been steady, fair, fiercely protective of his family, but never blind to truth. If he were alive, he'd have seen through Emily's sugary smile, her careful control. He would have noticed the way Daniel started folding in on himself, shaped by someone else's will. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the small fireproof box I kept beneath my cot. The key had rusted slightly, but it turned with a soft snap. Inside were the usual things: insurance papers, Tom's old war medals, a few legal documents, and one envelope. Yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed with a piece of red wax. On the front, in Tom's unmistakable hand, were the words, "To be opened if things go wrong." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, not typed, not formal, but written with the care and plainness that had always defined Tom. "My Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm guessing something has shifted in the family. I won't pretend to know when or how. But I want you to remember one thing. You still have power. You always did. And I've done what I could to make sure you're protected, even if our son forgets who raised him. There are things you don't know, but you'll find them in the documents beneath this letter. I trusted Langley to handle everything. If you ever feel lost, call him. He'll remind you who you are. You gave this family everything. Now it's time to reclaim something for yourself. Love." Always, Tom. I held the letter to my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt warmth, not from the room, but from within. A pulse, a stir, a reminder. I was not a ghost. I was not a burden. I was not nothing. Something had broken. Yes. But it had also been revealed. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of everything else. I read Tom's letter 3 times before I even noticed the second envelope. It was tucked beneath his handwriting, crisp and official looking, a thick cream envelope sealed with an embossed stamp. Inside, I found a copy of our will. Not the one Daniel had shown me after Tom passed. A different one, notarized 6 months later. This one had my name in full, with clear instructions outlining my rights to certain assets, a trust, a deed. Didn't understand all of it at first. Legal language always felt like a net meant to tangle people like me. But I understood enough. Tom had known. Some part of him must have seen it coming. Maybe not the details, not the exact shape of the betrayal, but he knew Daniel could be swayed, that Emily had an eye for control. He never said it aloud, but now I could hear it in memory. The way he'd gently ask me to double-check our savings, the quiet way he hesitated when Daniel offered to take care of the paperwork. Tom knew I needed someone in my corner, even if he couldn't be there anymore. At the bottom of the stack was a yellow Post-it note in faded ink. Call Robert Langley if you need help. He'll know what to do. Robert Langley, Tom's old friend. A real estate attorney with a dry sense of humor and a sharp mind. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Tom's funeral, when Robert had hugged me too tightly and said, "If you ever need me, you call. I mean it." That night, after pacing the basement floor for what felt like hours, I finally picked up my phone. He answered on the second ring. "Hello? Robert. It's Margaret Halloran." There was a long pause, then a soft, surprised laugh. "Maggie? I'll be damned. It's good to hear your voice. What's going on?" I swallowed hard. "I think I need your help." And I think Tom knew I would. We arranged to meet the next day at a quiet diner just off the main road. I wore my coat with the loose buttons and carried the documents in a canvas tote. When Robert arrived, he looked older than I remembered, a little slower in his step, but his eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still kind. We ordered coffee, and I slid the envelope across the table. He read in silence. Occasionally, his eyebrows lifted. Once, he muttered, "I'll be damned again." When he finally looked up, his face was tight with restrained anger. "Margaret, do you know what this means?" I nodded slightly. "Some of it." He leaned back in the booth. "Tom was smart, smarter than most. He set up a secondary trust in your name, completely protected. And that house, the one you and Tom lived in before Daniel convinced you to move, it was never fully transferred. You still legally own half of it." I blinked. "But Daniel told me he handled everything, that the proceeds were put toward—" "He sold it behind your back," Robert interrupted gently. "Didn't tell you. And I've got a hunch he kept the profits. I'll verify, but it won't be hard." I stared down at the chipped rim of my mug. "There's more," he said, voice darkening. "Emily withdrew nearly $20,000 from a joint savings account 3 months after Tom passed, using your name. The signature doesn't match your records. I can have a handwriting analyst confirm it." My breath caught. "She forged me?" "I'm afraid so." I looked away, toward the window. Outside, cars passed by in a blur of movement. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, willing myself not to cry. I thought, maybe I was imagining things, that I was being sensitive. I whispered. But they made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was just in the way. Robert's jaw tightened. "This wasn't just neglect, Margaret. This was theft and manipulation. You've been lied to, and from what I can tell, isolated on more purpose." The words stung. Not because I didn't know them to be true, but because hearing them aloud made them real in a way they hadn't been before. I thought of the cold dinners, the erased birthday, the vase gone missing. Emily's voice on the phone. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had erased me with intention. I took a deep breath and looked Robert in the eye. "What do we do?" He softened a little. "We start slow. I'll quietly pull all property records and financial statements. No noise, no warning. We'll build a case. I have friends at the courthouse who still owe me a few favors. How?" "Long will it take?" He sighed. "A few months, maybe more." I nodded slowly. "That's fine." He raised an eyebrow. "Most people want revenge quickly." I smiled. Not bitter, not cruel. Just steady. So does infection. But healing takes longer. He let out a quiet laugh. "You've changed, Margaret. I've remembered." He leaned forward again. "I'll help however I can. I promise. You that?" We parted with a hug and no fanfare. I walked home slower than usual, but lighter somehow. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of a plan forming. Not built from spite, but from something older. deeper. The need to reclaim what had been quietly taken. When I returned to the basement that night, the cake from my birthday still sat on the table. I lit the candle. Not for celebration, but for clarity. The flame danced, small but certain, and I made myself a promise. One that burned in silence, warm and patient. They would not see it coming, but they would feel it. I left before dawn. No suitcase, no tears. Just a canvas bag with a clean blouse, my journal, and Tom's letter folded neatly inside. There was no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. Only a quiet note taped to the basement door, written in ink I made sure didn't smudge. I will not be nothing anymore. I didn't wait to see their reaction. I didn't need to. Let them wake up and feel the space I used to occupy. Let them wonder. Not because I wanted them to chase me, but because I was finally done chasing the version of family they dangled and then denied. The apartment Robert helped me find was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but it had sunlight. I'll never forget how that first morning felt. Pale orange light warmed the windowsill where I'd placed Tom's photograph. There were no voices above me, no footsteps pacing the ceiling, just birdsong and the hum of a new beginning. The trust gave me more than just financial security. It gave me autonomy. I opened a bank account in my own name. I changed my will. I signed papers with Robert that set a quiet, determined process in motion, recovering my half of the house Daniel sold and the funds Emily forged. It would take time, he said. I told him I had plenty, but the bigger work happened in smaller ways. Bought a lavender shawl. It was silly, really. Just a soft wool wrap from a corner boutique downtown. But when I tried it on in front of the mirror, I saw someone who still deserved softness, who still wanted color in her life. I found a watercolor class at the community center. My hands were stiff at first, the brushes heavier than I remembered, but the colors made me feel young again. Blues and golds, soft greens, the sweep of a horizon that belonged only to me. I painted lilacs one day, and the instructor said they looked like memory. I smiled at that. Then came the library. I used to take Daniel there as a child. He would run to the nonfiction section while I lingered in memoirs. Now I returned alone, not to read, but to write. I sat in the far corner near the window and filled my journal with stories I'd carried for too long. Things I had never told anyone. Things that now needed a place to live. I volunteered at a senior center on Thursdays, teaching memoir writing to women who had their own invisible wounds. We wrote about gardens and husbands, about losses and small rebellions. One woman shared how she used to sneak chocolates before dinner and never told her late husband. Another wrote about the love letters she still kept in a shoebox under her bed. Their voices healed something in me. And then, one autumn afternoon, I met Eloise. She was standing outside the library wearing a raincoat and reading the bulletin board. Noticed her because she was humming an old jazz tune, the kind Tom used to play on vinyl while cooking. I smiled and said, "You have good taste." She looked over and smiled. "And you have a good memory." We struck up a conversation that turned into tea at the cafe across the street. She was a widow, too. 10 years alone, 1 son in another, state who rarely called. Her words were warm but never pitying. She asked about my painting. I asked about her garden. By the end of our tea, she said, "We have a little book circle on Sundays, just a few of us women. No pressure, but you'd fit right in." And just like that, I did. That Sunday, I walked into a sunlit living room with mismatched chairs, lemon cake on a plate, and 5 women who welcomed me like I'd always belonged. We read poetry, laughed at old gossip, and shared the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. For the first time in years, I imagined a life outside my family's shadow. A life that didn't revolve around pleasing people who refused to see me. A life that was mine. but there was still one final step to take. One morning, as red leaves began to scatter across the sidewalks, Robert called. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I've never been more sure," I replied. He had finished the paperwork to begin the sale of the house Daniel now lived in. Technically, my name was still on the deed. Tom had seen to that. And now, with legal proof of the forged transactions and unauthorized sale of our former home, we had leverage. Clean, undeniable leverage. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to ruin them. I wanted something they never gave me. Choice. The choice to remove myself. To reclaim the part of my life they had taken without ever asking. Robert filed the sale, listing the next day. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't need to. He would find out when the letter arrived. Formal, emotionless, stamped and notarized. It would sit in their mailbox like a truth they couldn't bury. I imagined Emily reading it aloud, her hands trembling, eyes scanning for loopholes. I imagined Daniel pacing, angry, confused, perhaps even remorseful, though that part I doubted. But what mattered was not their reaction. It was mine. Because the moment the papers were signed, I felt something inside me finally fall quiet. Not defeated, but settled. Like the last note in a long, unfinished song. I walked that evening, through the park, past the old stone bridge, wrapped in my lavender shawl. The air smelled like wood smoke and wind. The sky turned pink at the edges. I wasn't alone. I had my voice, my pen, my stories. Had the version of myself they tried to erase, alive, well, and painting again. And soon they would learn. You cannot unmake a woman who remembers who she is. I hadn't set foot in that house in nearly 6 months. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the porch rail was peeling. The hydrangeas Tom and I planted were wilted, unwatered, their color drained from neglect. Or perhaps just reflection. Sometimes homes mirror the people inside them. Robert stood beside me on the walkway, calm, respectful. Behind him, the realtor, a young woman named Melissa, adjusted her folder under one arm and gave me a soft nod. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the door. Daniel opened it. His face froze. He didn't speak right away. He just stared, like he wasn't sure I was real. Behind him, Emily appeared, wearing a robe and holding a half-empty coffee cup. Her brows lifted, her mouth already curling with practiced disdain. "Mom," Daniel finally said, clearing his throat. "We didn't expect—" "No," I said quietly. "You didn't." I stepped inside without waiting for permission. My heels tapped softly against the hardwood I used to polish with lemon oil. It smelled different now. Artificial, sterile, as if even the house had forgotten how to feel lived in. Emily's eyes darted to the manila envelope in my hand. "What is this?" she asked flatly. Robert followed me in and closed the door gently behind him. "I think it's time we talked," I said. We all sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tom and I once ate anniversary dinners, where Daniel used to do his homework, where I sat alone during birthday breakfasts, waiting for a greeting that never came. I opened the envelope. "I'm selling my portion of this house," I said calmly, sliding the documents across the table. "Here are the title transfer forms. And the will. The real one." Daniel's face paled. Emily leaned forward, her voice rising. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," I interrupted. "And I have," Robert added. "Mrs. Halloran retains legal ownership of 50% of this property. That was never transferred. And in light of the financial discrepancies we've uncovered, she's fully within her rights to sell." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to shout, but his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a better script. "I don't understand," he said. You were living with us. You offered care, I said. What you gave me was containment, dismissal, cold plates and colder words, Emily scoffed. We gave you a home. You should be grateful. I turned to her slowly. You gave me a basement and silence. You watched me become invisible and said nothing. You knew what you were doing, Emily. The vase, the birthday, the forged signature. You erased me in pieces. Daniel looked at her sharply. What signature? I pulled out the copy of the bank statement Robert had given me. This one. Taken 3 months after Tom died. You told me everything was handled. But you never asked if I agreed. You just took. Emily's face twisted. You're really doing this? Making us look like criminals? No, I said softly. You did that yourselves. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. Why now? Why not come to us first? We could have worked something out. I looked at him for a long time, and I thought about the night I baked my own cake, about the cold dinners on the steps, about hearing Emily say I'd forget my own birthday. I asked for respect, I said. You handed me silence. He looked down. I placed one last sheet on the table. Tom's letter, copied, not original. This is from your father. He saw what I didn't want to admit, and he did what he could to protect me, to remind me who I was. Emily shook her head. So what now? You kick us out of our home? No, I replied. You can refinance if you'd like. Buy out my share. You have options. What you don't have anymore is control. She leaned back, crossing her arms. This is cruel. I stood up, wrapping my lavender shawl around my shoulders. You called me nothing. You treated me like weight to carry, not a woman who carried you. This isn't cruelty. This is consequence. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. As I reached the front door, I paused, looking back just once. You made me feel like nothing, I said. But I remember who I am now. Then I walked out, not broken, not bitter, but whole. And behind me, the wind rustled the dried hydrangeas on the porch. Even they seemed to nod in agreement. 2 years later, the house I live in smells of rosemary and soft earth. It's nothing grand, just a little white cottage with chipped shutters and ivy curling up the porch rail. But it breathes. It holds warmth. And most days, so do I. The garden was the first thing I rebuilt. It began with 3 tulip bulbs, planted with gloved fingers and quiet hope. Now it overflows. Lavender, thyme, sunflowers that lean like curious neighbors. I walk the path barefoot in the mornings, coffee in one hand, a journal in the other. The stones I laid with my own hands click gently under my steps. One is painted sky blue with my name etched in white. Margaret. Still growing. My Sunday circle has grown too. What started with just Eloise and me has now become a full table of voices. Older women with stories tucked deep in their bones. Some come with grief, others with anger or shame, or dreams they buried long ago. We sit beneath the trellis and read aloud from journals, memoirs, letters that were never meant to be sent. There's always tea and lemon cake, and no judgment. I read now, too, not just as a listener, but as a voice. The same voice that once stayed quiet for too long. Sometimes I share the chapter about the basement or the letter Tom left me. Other times, I read about watercolor mornings or how it felt to wear the lavender shawl for the first time and recognize myself again. They always listen closely, not out of pity, but reverence. Because a woman who remembers her story becomes more than memory. She becomes truth. One breezy afternoon, as the wind tugged gently at the curtains, I found an envelope in the mailbox. It was addressed in familiar handwriting, hesitant, almost unsure. Inside was a letter. It was from my grandson, Andrew. Dear Grandma, Dad told us what happened. Not everything, but enough. I want to say I'm sorry. For not asking where you went. For not noticing sooner. I hope it's okay to write. I hope you're okay. You always made me feel seen when I was little. I remember your pancakes, your stories. I remember your laugh. I think I forgot for a while that you had your own stories too. Love. Andrew. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside the painted stone in my garden. The wind picked up just slightly, carrying the scent of lavender and earth and late spring promise. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I simply smiled, because I didn't need an apology to know I had healed. But it was a small grace. And sometimes grace is all we're really after in the end. There are still quiet moments, of course. Mornings when I sit in my old rocking chair and listen to the birds, or evenings when I hear echoes of Tom's voice in the kettle's whistle. I don't fill those silences anymore. I let them rest beside me like old friends, and on the days when the world feels too fast or too loud, I walk barefoot to the garden. I run my fingers over the rosemary and smell the stories still growing in the soil. I know now that I was never truly erased, only buried. And what they forgot to do was account for the bloom that happens after winter. Because even the deepest roots remember the sun. I don't think of revenge the way I used to. Not as fire, not as fury. What I wanted was peace. And that I earned. With every step away from what hurt me, with every word I wrote down, and every breath I took that belonged only to me. I didn't just survive them. I redefined myself without them. And that, I suppose, is the greatest justice there is. Sometimes the greatest revenge is living the life they tried to take from you, and loving every single day of it.